The year of 2023 has been a wild one for the University of Michigan's football program, with an NCAA investigation and an FBI investigation already taking place. Now, an in-person scouting scandal has rocked the program. In this video, we will look at the bylaws Michigan is accused of breaking, as well as some of the circumstantial evidence that is available publicly. And finally, at the end, we'll talk head coach Jim Harbaugh and what punishments may be down the road. So let's get into it. So to start, Michigan is being accused of breaking 3 NCAA bylaws and 1 Big Ten policy. We'll start with the NCAA as they're the main overseer of college football. First, we have in-person scouting, which has been banned since 1994, and it states, quote, off-campus in-person scouting of future opponents in the same season is prohibited, end quote. Second, we have the bylaw pertaining to recording opponents' sidelines, and it states, quote, any attempt to record either through audio or video means any signals given by an opposing player, coach, or other team personnel is prohibited, end quote. And finally, we have lack of institutional control, which will probably be Michigan's biggest problem in terms of the NCAA, but we'll get to that later. But the Big Ten have taken this unprecedented scandal and have chosen to act quickly, using their sportsmanship policy to punish the Wolverines during the season and before the conclusion of its investigation, by suspending head coach Jim Harbaugh from being on the sidelines for the final 3 games of the regular season. However, they're willing to allow him to coach the team during the week. Is this fair to the Wolverines, and does it make any sense? Not really, but for the Big Ten, this is an unprecedented action for an unprecedented scandal, showing that the NCAA and the Big Ten are treating this as a very serious infraction by the University of Michigan. And for those not aware, the university was already under investigation by the NCAA for recruiting violations and using too many coaches during practice. Jim Harbaugh chose to lie to NCAA investigators, which has hurt that relationship. Now, it is important to remember that deciphering signs is common practice in college football, and that is not what Michigan is being accused of doing. They are being accused of using illegal practices to obtain their opponent's signs for deciphering, as well as also having a member of their staff on the sideline of Central Michigan to scout Michigan State earlier in the year. So how did we get here? So first, we got to go back to October 18th, when Ross Dellinger and Dan Wetzel of Yahoo Sports would report that the University of Michigan was notified of potential NCAA violations regarding in-person scouting and recording future opponents' sidelines. Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh would release a statement the following day saying he had no knowledge of any in-person scouting operation, something that will likely come back to haunt him down the road. Then, on October 20th, Pete Thamel and Mark Schlabach of ESPN would report that the alleged mastermind of the operation was a guy named Connor Stalions. Stalions is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and a die-hard Michigan fan. He claims that he volunteered with the Wolverines from 2015 to 2022, flying back and forth between Camp Pendleton in California and Ann Arbor on his own dime before being hired in 2022 by the university as an off-field analyst. Stalions would go on to be suspended on October 20th, and ESPN would report in the following days that Stalions had purchased tickets to more than 30 games of future and potential opponents of the Wolverines, using his own credit card and name for the ticket purchases. The tickets were all purchased around the 50-yard line and high enough that the opposing sideline was in clear view. Then, smartphones would be used to record the signs by the team in which Michigan was scouting. The Washington Post would report on October 25th that an outside investigative firm that has not yet been named alerted the NCAA to the potential violations and turned over all of their evidence. It's important to remember that only the investigative firm, the NCAA, and the Big Ten have seen this evidence thus far. None of this is public information. And the next day, ESPN's Dan Murphy would report that a former Division III coach told him that Stallions paid him a couple $100s to record the sidelines of Penn State and Rutgers on 3 separate occasions. And quickly, evidence of Stallions on the Central Michigan sideline for their game against Michigan State earlier this year started to surface. Central Michigan is now under investigation by the NCAA to see if they were a part of this operation. Central Michigan, to this day, has been unable to say whether Stallions was on their sideline or not, which means he probably was. And this is important given the Chippewas coaching staff connections to Michigan, where head coach Jim McElwain was an assistant for the past year. And more evidence would start to surface on social media, albeit circumstantial, as Stallions was seen on camera numerous times staring intently at the opposing team's sidelines before barking into the offensive and defensive coordinator's ear. Now, this doesn't show anything illegal being done. However, given the things that Stallions is accused of doing, it makes it all look very suspicious. Meanwhile, the rest of the Big Ten and most coaches around the country were very concerned by the allegations, and Stallions would go on to resign from his position on November 3rd, telling The Athletic, "I love the University of Michigan and its football program, and I am extremely grateful for the opportunity I've had to work with the incredible student athletes, Coach Harbaugh, and the other coaches that have been a part of the Michigan football family during my tenure, and I do not want to be a distraction from what I hope to be a championship run for the team, and I will continue to cheer them on." End quote. Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti would then notify Michigan of potential punishment for violating the Big Ten sportsmanship policy. The Big Ten sportsmanship policy states, quote, "The Big Ten Conference expects all contests involving a member institution to be conducted without compromise to any fundamental element of sportsmanship. Such fundamental elements include integrity of the competition, civility towards all, and respect, particularly towards opponents and officials." And University of Michigan President Santa Ono would then send a letter to the Big Ten threatening legal action if Harbaugh is suspended, and in return, the Big Ten would toss that letter in the trash as they would suspend Harbaugh from being on the sidelines come game day for the final 3 games of the regular season. This comes after the Big Ten had an extended conversation with the NCAA where evidence was given to the Big Ten on what Michigan was up to. And Michigan would attempt to get a temporary restraining order against the Big Ten, which would allow Harbaugh to continue on as head coach and push all of this to the courts. However, the temporary restraining order wouldn't come in time for their game the very next day after the suspension was handed down, and Michigan would be forced to take the field without their head coach for the biggest game of the season thus far. But the Wolverines would respond by getting a gritty win on the road against Penn State, leading to one of the corniest post-game interviews of all time by Michigan offensive coordinator Sharon Moore.
I want to thank the Lord. I want to thank Coach Harbaugh. Fucking love you, man. Love the shit out of you, man. This is for you.
Michigan would continue to posture as if they were willing to see this fight through. But one day before their hearing for a temporary restraining order, they would suddenly change course, as they would accept the 3-game suspension handed down by the Big Ten. And in return, the Big Ten would drop their investigation. However, they reserved the right to issue more punishments depending on how the NCAA investigation plays out. And just when it looked as though things would start to calm down, Michigan would announce the firing of linebackers coach Chris Partridge for trying to destroy information associated with the investigation. And it would later come out through reporting by Ross Dellinger and Dan Wetzel of Yahoo Sports that a Michigan booster who goes by Uncle T was partially funding Stalions' operation. So where do we go from here? So it's quite clear that Jim Harbaugh and the NCAA are not on the best of terms after Harbaugh lied about buying a couple of recruits a hamburger. Now, we can all agree that him buying a couple of recruits a hamburger is not a big deal. This situation, however, is completely different and way more serious than buying a couple of recruits a hamburger. See, Jim Harbaugh hired Connor Stalions, and one of the jobs that he gave Stalions on game day was to decipher the opponent's signs. Now, this is common practice in college football. Every team has a guy who does this. Sometimes they're on the sideline, and other times they're up in the coach's box with a pair of binoculars. But every team has a person on their staff who does this. And Stalions took this and went above and beyond with his paying a third party to record future opponents' signs in advance of their upcoming matchups, or, in Ohio State's case, everywhere you go. Now, Stalions may have been the mastermind behind all this. That may be true. However, it's Jim Harbaugh's responsibility to promote compliance with the NCAA's rules and oversee his staff to make sure that they are doing such. This is important because thus far, Michigan and Harbaugh have maintained that he had no knowledge of the operation. Nobody should believe this, given the reason Stalions was on the sideline deciphering signs on game day to begin with was because he was hired by Harbaugh for that very reason, and it's Harbaugh's job to oversee him. And if he failed this badly at doing that, it would show just plain ignorance on Harbaugh's part, and would show that honestly, he is no longer fit to run a college football program. Now, personally, I like Jim Harbaugh, and I have nothing against him. He is a fantastic coach, and it's no coincidence that winning has followed him everywhere he has been. He went to Stanford and created a consistent winner. Then he goes off to the NFL, to the San Francisco 49ers, and again builds a consistent winner. Then he comes home to his alma mater, which was not in a good place at the time, and again builds a consistent winner. This is no fluke. The dude is flat out just a really good football coach, whether you like him or not. That's just the truth. However, this scandal will be a massive black eye for him and the Michigan program going forward. You can easily make the argument that Harbaugh has not promoted rules compliance, given how he himself has set the example of lying to the NCAA over something as small as a hamburger. And it's also been made very clear by Harbaugh, if you truly believe that he had no knowledge of the operation, that he failed to properly oversee multiple members of his staff. This all clearly rises to lack of institutional control, and that's if you believe he didn't know about the operation. I, on the other hand, believe that in some form he probably knew. We all know that college football coaches are notorious control freaks, and they are more likely to cover things up as opposed to reporting wrongdoings within their program. We have seen this time and time again in college athletics. But regardless of whether he knew or not, he's ultimately responsible. As the head coach, it's his responsibility. And given all the things that have taken place in his program over just this year alone, I could see him easily being suspended for a full season at the end of all this. And that might not even be enough. You could see wins vacated. You could see scholarships taken away. In this situation, when a fine doesn't really do anything to a university the stature of the University of Michigan. And the worst part of all this, for the university, it wasn't necessary for the Wolverines to be successful. They have had a ton of talent come through during Harbaugh's tenure. They did not win every game because of the cheating. However, that did help, and it may have helped in their biggest games of the year. and there should be no denying that. Michigan could very well go on to win the national championship this year. They are that good, and whether it's fair or not, they are going to be branded as cheaters going forward. And there will be an asterisk next to whatever they end up accomplishing this year and maybe even every year of Harbaugh's tenure, depending on how far back this really goes. So with that, what do you think? Did Jim Harbaugh know? And whether he knew or not, what should his punishment be?